And how can we load data from Spotify, like list of all albums and tracks?
All right, so let me think here. We need to do two things. We need to go to the Spotify website, and first we need a user account. So the person running our application, I mean right now it's just us, but if somebody else were to run it, they need a Spotify account. So first we need a user account. And then once we have the user account, then we have to actually, as a developer, we have to create an application.
And it will be something like application ID that we can use in our application, in our ExtReact application.
Right. So we need
Okay.
that application so that when we call Spotify to get these data feeds, it knows sort of who we are.
Okay, let's do it.
So first step is I will go to Spotify.
And create an account.
Yeah, so normally you would come in here, let me log out and just show you what it looks like. You would do sign up. Now I've already done this. So if you're watching this video, you need to come in here and create your Spotify account. So basically you just register it, you get a confirmation email, and then you have an account. Once you've done that, so I'll go ahead and log in. So let me go back to the previous page. I've already done this. So I'll log in as myself.
And what you need to do to set up application.
So down at the bottom here, there's a link
Developers.
to exactly. So now we're at developer.spotify.com.
Okay, it's like special website for developers who are developing application using data from Spotify.
Right.
And how to get data?
So under the docs here, you can see here, there's many APIs in here. We're just coding a regular web application. So what I want to do is go down to reference.
And use web API.
Right. So there are many, many feeds. What we will do is we want to see a list of recent releases.
Like recent albums.
Right. So if I come down here, this is the URL we will eventually be calling.
So we could just call this URL and get a list of latest releases.
Basically, but not quite. So what the documentation explains here is that when we make a request to this endpoint, we need to include authentication information, and that's what's being documented here.
Okay, and that's what we need our application ID for.
Yes, right. So if I click through here, we'll get to this authorization guide. It's pretty extensive. And what this shows is that there's kind of 3 authorization flows. Now, the details of these aren't really important, but we need to use one of these. So let me kind of review real quickly what these do. One is this authorization code. That's convenient if you had like a mobile application, like a native application. If you are authenticating on the back end, that's where this flow comes in, client credentials flow. But if you're coding a regular web application like we are, then we use this thing called implicit grant. So let me click through on that and scroll down a little bit. So there's some diagrams that kind of explain the flow. But here's what we will be doing.
I see there is a client ID. So it's exactly ID of our applications that we will create to use this API, this web API from Spotify.
Exactly. So here are the steps. When we get to our application the first time, we need to redirect the user to this URL and then
Provide client ID.
exactly. So it says here query parameter. So as a query parameter, we'll provide the ID of our application. And then in addition, we have to tell Spotify where to redirect to come back to our application.
So it's URL of our ExtReact application, something like localhost and port number.
Exactly. So the next step we need to do then is we need to actually register our application so we get this client ID.
Let's do it.
Let me go up here then and go to the dashboard.
And we can just create a client ID using application.
Right, so it says create an app. I'll go ahead and do that. So let's see here. App name. So I'm going to call this ExtReact. And then we can just put any description we want in here.
And it will be a desktop application.
Right. Next.
We don't want to use our application for commercial purposes. It's just only for education. And we need to agree to all points.
All right.
And that's it. We have this client ID.
So notice there's that client ID that we talked about before. Now there's one other thing we need to do. Spotify, we basically have to whitelist these redirects where Spotify comes back to us. So that's this redirects URL section here. Now when we run our app, here's our running app. Our app by default runs on localhost 1962 here. So right?
Yeah, if you would run your real production application, of course it will have a normal URL, not just localhost, but for this course, for educational purposes, it's totally fine to just add URL with localhost. And maybe we can add 2 more URLs with like next port numbers, just to be sure if we will run our application at another port, we will not need to edit this configuration settings again.
Right. So when we do that npm start, the port number's assigned dynamically. It defaults to 1962, but if that port is in use, it'll use a different port. So right, just to be careful.
So it will increment +1.
That's right. Okay, so now we're finished. So I'll hit save, and I'll come here and I'll copy. And now let's go back to our application. Now, when we created the app, that starter app, it actually included this file called authenticate.js. We just give you that file. So let me talk about how this is structured. What we need to do as we enter our app is we need to run this function. What the function says is there information up, after that hash mark, right?
So like we will check if there is a token in our URL.
Right, so if we already went to Spotify and authenticated, that information will be there. Mm-hmm. If it was not there, then we need to redirect to Spotify to get that information. Spotify will then redirect back to our application. We'll re-enter this function. We'll then say, oh, the token is there now, and then we're free to go.
So we will use this token to load our data. And you need to insert client ID into the second function.
Right, so I copied this before when we were out at the developer site for Spotify, so I'll just go ahead and paste. So let me kind of talk about this. That is that URL for doing authentication. That's what's documented in that authentication guide over in Spotify. This is the client ID, and then we have to tell, remember, there's 2 things we have to pass to Spotify as query fields. One is the client ID, and one is the redirect, URL. That's what's happening here. So basically this code just says, hey, tell Spotify to come back to wherever we are, right? So it might be 1962, 1963, whatever. Then we're putting together the query string here. So we're saying, hey, Spotify, here's the client ID. Here is the redirect URI.
And we relocate our page to this Spotify URL for authentication.
Right, so window.location, it'll just do the redirect there. All right, so now we need to run this function. So if I save this and go into index.html, we need to use our new function. So I need to import that.
So like import authenticate function from our authenticate.js file.
Oops. And then I need to run it. So this means as we enter our app, index.js is run every time somebody enters the app. It will run this function and it will do that redirect, the first time in. So in theory, I have not saved yet, but here's our running app. I'll go ahead and save it and we'll see what happens.
So we are redirected to Spotify. Now we need to agree that Spotify will use our user account to get access to this data. And click agree.
Right. So what happened is, just to review the flow, our app reloaded, we ran our function, it did not see the tokens up in the URL, so it did a redirect. We're now at the Spotify site doing authentication. If you look up in the URL here, there's the client ID, There's the redirect URI. That's what we put together in our own function. If I click agree here, it will then go back to this redirect URI, and you can see it's localhost, 1962. So I'll go ahead and hit agree. Then we re-entered our app. Our app saw that this information was there now, so now we're in our app. So from now on, if we were to actually fetch data from Spotify, we would use the authentication token, where is it, up in this URL.
So we could use this token to request all data from Spotify, like list of albums, list of tracks, and any statistics that we want.
Right, exactly. So I've just highlighted that access token. So we just have to make sure we include that in every future request.
Let's do it.
Okay.